Well, hello, everyone. Hey, it's great to see you. I'm so glad that we're together today. But before I jump into the sermon, I want to encourage you to be here and to invite someone next week when we kick off the Made for This series. I know Chip just talked about it, but I just want to give my plug also. I'm going to bring an At the Movies message that I'm asking God to use in your life. And look, today is the ideal time for you to level up by getting into a Made for This group, which will start next week. You'll enjoy the people, the conversation will be meaningful for you. It will move the needle for you spiritually, so make sure you step into that opportunity. Well, the series that we're wrapping up today is called Said No One Ever. Have you seen the Said No One Ever memes and jokes on social media? They normally include some irony or some sarcasm, which is why some of us like them so much. Some of my favorites are, "Can I order that without the bacon? Said no one ever." "I must have prayed about it too much." Said no one ever. "I love the sound of my alarm clock." Said no one ever. "I have enough shoes." Said no one ever. "Your political rant on social media totally changed my mind." Said no one ever. "And since this is church, that sermon was too short." Said no one ever. And here's the one that we're going to explore today. "People never disappoint me." Said no one ever. We call the Bible the good book. We know the Bible has good news. But if you've read much of the Bible, you know it also records a lot of disappointing behavior by many different people. And not just behavior that was disappointing to God, but behavior that was disappointing to other people. And when I think of people in Scripture who were repeatedly let down by those who were close to them, I always think of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Now, this is not the Joseph that we portray at Christmas, the husband of Mary. We meet that Joseph in the first book of the New Testament, but we meet the original Joseph way back in the first book of the Old Testament. The last quarter of the book of Genesis tells the story of his remarkable life, which was significantly shaped by the disappointing things that people did to him. Why do so many people love the fictional character Harry Potter? I think one reason is because Harry overcame so many challenges in those stories. His parents died when he was a baby. He lived with distant family members who did not love him. Harry was constantly harassed and attacked by evil forces. And yet, in spite of so much loss, so much pain, so much injustice, despite many betrayals, Harry Potter retained his humility and his goodness. And if that is the kind of hero to which you are drawn, you will love Joseph from the book of Genesis, because he is even more remarkable, because his life is not fiction, it is history. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham, who was known for his great faith. But Abraham and his descendants consistently made poor decisions that brought dysfunction into their family. The home in which Joseph grew up was marked by favoritism and rivalry. His father, Jacob, had multiple wives simultaneously. So Joseph lived in a home with people he could not trust. Joseph was the first child of his father's favorite wife, which resulted in him being spoiled and overprotected. He was not just seen and loved by his father, which is good. He was preferred and favored by his father, which is not. Look at verses 3 and 4 of Genesis 37. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. Have you ever had anyone in your life who could not say a kind word about you or to you? Now, maybe you've heard of Joseph's coat of many colors, his Technicolor dream coat, one production called it. The gift that his father used to try to elevate Joseph in the family, well, it instead created a relational deficit between Joseph and his half-brothers. And look, almost none of this was Joseph's fault. It was clueless parenting by his father. But when God revealed to Joseph in a dream that he would one day rule over his brothers, it was not wise of Joseph to tell his brothers about that dream, because when he did, they became even angrier with him. They hated him even more, if that was possible. So as Joseph approached his brothers while they were working in the field and he had been back at the house relaxing, their bitterness toward him just boiled over. Genesis 37:18 says, when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. I compared Joseph to the character Harry Potter earlier. Well, Joseph's brothers' hateful words about him sound like something Voldemort would say about Harry. They wanted Joseph dead. Look, Joseph's father Jacob was wrong and he was foolish to play favorites with his children, but his attitude does not justify the contempt that Joseph's brothers developed for him. They likely never thought of themselves as killers, but they indulged their hatred so often for so long, they eventually got there. At the last moment, they decided to spare Joseph's life, and they sold him to human traffickers. They sold him to slave traders. And then they took that special gift his father had given him, that colorful, "You're my favorite son" coat, and they dipped it in animal blood and gave it to their dad as evidence that their brother had been killed by a wild creature. One of the greatest disappointments that any of us can experience in life is to learn that those who should care the most for us care very little for us. If you don't know what that's like, I'm glad, because that's how it should be. But some of you know all too well what I'm talking about. The people who've been most against you in this life are the people who should have been most for you. The parent you could not please. The child who took all that you gave but never appreciated those things or you. The sibling who has always been bitter because of perceived favoritism, which you did not want or ask for, and which may have only existed in that sibling's mind. The spouse who, instead of being your biggest fan, became your biggest critic and your biggest enemy. As a pastor, I've noticed that family disappointments are some of the most difficult for people to eventually escape. They follow some people through life. They cast a shadow over all future relationships. And what was done to Joseph was as painful as it can get for a person. Imagine the terror of being thrown into a cistern by your brothers and hear them argue about whether or not they should kill you. Imagine hearing their unvarnished hatred and disgust for you. Imagine watching your brothers sneer as you are carted off to some place they don't know where and you don't know where. And imagine the point at which Joseph realized that his parents thought he was dead. They didn't even know he was alive. When people disappoint us, we can respond in several ways. In fact, there are several categories of responses in which people almost always fall. And in Joseph's story, I see three destructive paths that he could have taken but wisely avoided. And I see one productive path that was the hardest path of all that he wisely opted to take, which eventually redeemed everything that had happened to him. And I want us to look at each of those paths for a moment. The first destructive path that Joseph resisted after all this pain in his life was self-indulgence. After his brothers sold him as a slave, Joseph was taken to Egypt, and he was sold to a man named Potiphar, who was essentially the head of the secret service for Egypt, the elite force that protected the king of Egypt, who was known as Pharaoh. And before long, Potiphar noticed that Joseph was a very special person. He could just get things done, and he could be trusted with anything. And he influenced other people in positive ways without even trying hard. Verse 2 of Genesis 39 explains why these things were true. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did. Now, if you saw a person who had been sold into slavery by his own family, would you look at that person and say, the Lord is with that person? No, you and I would be tempted to say, it seems like God has abandoned that person. And some people in our culture might even call what's written in that Bible verse tone deaf, because you're not supposed to say the Lord is with someone if that person has been trafficked into slavery. But what a comfort it is to know that no matter how much people hurt us, no matter how much they disappoint us, no matter what wrong thing is done to us, God is with us. No one can drive God out of your life by the wrong or disappointing thing he or she does to you. This is an important reminder for all of us. When life is at its worst, God is still at work. I mean, the Bible just gives us account after account, person after person, story after story of people whose lives demonstrate this truth. And I just wonder, does anyone in this room need to hear this today? Does anyone need to hear that when life is at its worst, God is still working in your life? Does anyone need to be reminded that when circumstances are bad, God is still good? Did anyone just get heartbreaking news from a doctor? Did anyone just hear painful news about your child or your grandchild? Did anyone just get bad news at work, or maybe even learn that you are out of work? Did anyone just watch a promising relationship that you were excited about die on the vine? Friend, if God was still with Joseph after he had been sold into slavery by his own family, you can rest assured that God is with you after whatever difficulty you have faced, after whatever disappointment someone has committed against you. What did he say to his followers, Jesus, right before he ascended and returned back to heaven? Jesus said, "Be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Some versions of the Bible say, even to the end of the world. Now, what is it that we often say when our lives are falling apart? It feels like the world is what? Coming to an end. Jesus said, I will be with you even to the end of the world. So God was with Joseph. Though his parents believed he was dead, God was with Joseph. Though he was hated by those who should have loved him, God was with Joseph, even though the people who should have been looking for him were the reason that he had gone missing. But the fact that God was with Joseph did not cause his trials to cease. Did God protect Joseph from further disappointment? Did God look at Joseph's life and say, you know what, you've had enough hardship. I'm going to make sure you don't suffer anymore? It did not happen. Just as Joseph seemed to be recovering from the extreme wrong that had been done to him, he is mistreated yet again. Joseph caught the eye of the original desperate housewife, Potiphar's wife. Do you know this part of the story? Look at the end of verse 6 of Genesis 39. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. Pretty subtle, don't you think? Now, if Joseph had believed the modern lie that our bodies are our temples and that they've been given to us for our enjoyment, then he would have concluded, hey, look, I'm a guy who's been through a lot of difficult things. A little extracurricular pleasure just might be God's gift to me, God's way of comforting me. But Joseph knew God's character. And even though he was far from home, even though he lived far from anyone who would have had the same set of values that he had, Joseph knew what God taught about sex. And he knew that meeting Mrs. Potiphar's demand even if a part of him wanted to, would be wrong. Genesis 39:8 reads, but Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He's held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. The slave of the house is giving the woman of the house a lesson in divine values. By the way, which God is Joseph talking about? This God that he doesn't want to offend with his behavior? The God who allowed him to be sold into slavery? The God who did not protect him against his brother's anger and treachery? When people disappoint you, it is easy to believe that some self-indulgence will make you feel better, even if it's technically against God's will. But Joseph realized that kind of thinking and that kind of lifestyle would just multiply his concerns and his pain. It would not solve anything. You see, I cannot help but admire Joseph, who experienced so much disappointment at the hands of other people, for avoiding the path of self-indulgence. If you've been hurt, if you've been disappointed, you can bet the enemy of your soul will give you opportunities to indulge yourself. Be very wise and very discerning about whether or not you should take them. The second response Joseph resisted was the path of self-pity. What was Joseph's reward for this noble thing that he did, refusing to have an affair with his boss's wife? Potiphar's wife felt scorned, and so she accused Joseph of attempted rape, so Potiphar threw Joseph into prison. So the roller coaster of Joseph's life is not even close to an end. And Joseph could have given up. He could have been angry with God for seemingly abandoning him. But when Joseph got to prison, he did the same thing he did everywhere. He excelled there also. In fact, when the warden observed Joseph's skill and his integrity, he placed him in charge of all the other prisoners. So Joseph became the de facto administrator of the prison in which he was incarcerated. And that role gave Joseph the opportunity to meet two of the king's officials who were thrown into jail because they were suspected of misbehaving in some way. And when they asked for Joseph's help understanding some dreams that they had, Joseph candidly told one of them that he would soon be executed. And then Joseph correctly predicted that the other one would be restored to his position. And that should have been Joseph's ticket out of prison. But the final verse of Genesis 40 reads, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Joseph interprets this man's dreams, reassures him, tells him, you're not going to be killed, you're going to get your position back. And when that guy gets his position back, he forgets the one who comforted him and interpreted his dream. How many people is God going to allow to disappoint Joseph? How much can a person take before he or she is entitled to become bitter and to give up? How many people have to despise you or conspire to kill you or lie about you or forget how much you helped them before you are justified in feeling sorry for yourself? In the Old Testament book named after him, a man named Job suffers the loss of all of his possessions, the death of all of his children, and the loss of his health. And as he sat in rubble and ashes, he scraped his diseased skin with a broken piece of pottery. And when his wife saw him in that pitiful scene, she'd had enough. She said, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die." Sometimes even the people closest to us will tell us, you should just give up. Now, don't be too hard on Mrs. Job, because she had lost everything too. It was her lowest moment in life also. But Job knew, he understood that self-pity is never helpful. So he asked a question that you and I do not ask ourselves very often. Job said, should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? That is such an important question for us to ask. Job was not saying that God is the author of bad things. He's not. But all of us have realized that God doesn't necessarily protect us from every bad thing that can happen. And God certainly had not protected Joseph in his story. Friend, it is easy to trust God when your health is good, when your children are thriving, when your bank account has plenty of funds, when your life is #blessed. It's easy to sing of the goodness of God. But can you trust in God's goodness when your circumstances are not good, when times are hard, when you're going through a season of loss? Can you trust Him then? The Apostle Paul wrote, "We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but we are never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed." What is Paul saying? Paul is saying we will not give in to self-pity no matter how difficult life gets. Is that your testimony too? Is that the story of your faith? When you are suffering, when you are sad, when you are waiting on God, and as far as you're concerned, God is waiting too long, can you celebrate the fact that God is sustaining you even when He is not sparing you all pain? Or will your faith be the kind that Jesus talked about when He said, some people, the seed of God's word is planted in their lives, but then it's choked out by trouble and hardship? Don't let that be the story of your faith. Well, Joseph had more than one reason to take the path of self-pity, and yet he refused to do it. And when people disappoint you, I hope you will not allow yourself to take the path of self-pity. There's a third path that Joseph had to resist, and that path was retaliation. Now, some of us, when someone has wronged us, we kind of dream of the day that we'll be able to retaliate, that we'll be able to take revenge. And for many of us, that day never comes. In Joseph's case, it actually did. God did eventually rescue Joseph from prison. And when the king's sleep was being interrupted by some upsetting dreams, and none of the king's advisors could tell him what those dreams meant, the king's cupbearer finally remembered Joseph, who had interpreted his dream when he had been in prison. And the man said, wait a minute, when the king was angry with me and threw me in prison, I met a guy who interpreted my dream. And he told me that I would be restored to my position, which happened. And now I'm embarrassed to admit that I never thanked him and I never tried to help him. This man was a young Hebrew named Joseph. So Joseph was summoned to Pharaoh's palace where he interpreted the king's dreams. And those dreams meant that after 7 years of perfect growing conditions, there would come 7 years of brutal famine. And to prepare for those 7 years, the king would need to create a program to store grain and other resources so that Egypt could survive the ordeal. And when Joseph explained to the king that this is what his dreams meant, the king, Pharaoh, said to him, "That's awesome, Joseph, that you can tell me what my dreams mean. Now, since you understand the meaning of my dream, I am so impressed with you, I want you to take charge of the project to get us ready for what is coming." So Joseph was promoted from prisoner to prime minister in a day. You could say he interviewed well. And it all happened just as Joseph predicted. The good years came and they went. And then the famine hit very hard. And that is when some foreigners from a neighboring country came to buy grain. You're already ahead of me on this, aren't you? They presented themselves to the authorities, and Joseph recognized these men. They were his brothers, the ones who hated him, the ones who betrayed him, the ones who sold him into slavery. If revenge is a dish that is best served cold, this would be the tastiest revenge ever. More than a decade had passed, and they did not recognize Joseph, even though he knew them. So after a dramatic series of events in which Joseph tests their brothers and their love and loyalty to each other, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. Now, I normally summarize long passages of Scripture that are several paragraphs long, but this one is so moving, I just want to read it to you from Genesis 45. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. So the king heard what was going on. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. You know they were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you." Do you realize that Joseph is crediting God for all of the things that had happened to him, including the evil things? "And God is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me and all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you and your household and all your animals will starve." Then Joseph added, "Look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you have seen, and then bring my father here quickly." Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them, and after that, they began talking freely with him. Joseph must have missed school on the day they taught on revenge, because he is giving up a golden opportunity to take revenge on his brothers. Now he knows that they're going to have to go home and tell their father that Joseph is alive, and there are going to be some confessions, there are going to be some admissions, there's going to be some shame. But why is Joseph such a hero? It's not just because he was capable. He was extremely capable. It's not just because he was handsome. He was that too. It's not just because he was the cream that always rose to the top in every scenario. It's not just because he resisted temptation and even was willing to pay a price for resisting temptation. It's not just because he devised a plan to save Egypt and its international neighbors from famine. Joseph is a hero because he was most gracious with the people who disappointed him the most. A lot of people in Joseph's position would have concluded, God gave me this position so that I could get back at you. Joseph concluded, God gave me this position so that I could redeem you and restore your relationship to me. What you intended for harm, God meant for good. There is so much about Joseph's life that is instructive, but let me just give you 2 quick takeaways. First, don't wait until you're over it to forgive. Don't wait for your emotions to say, I have no more anger, I have no more resentment, and then forgive. Did you notice the emotion that poured out of Joseph the moment that he revealed his identity to his brothers? At one point, before he was ready for his brothers to know who he was, Joseph even walked out of the room and found a private place to weep. And I take that to mean that forgiving those who disappoint us should not be delayed until all of our emotions have leveled out. Rather, it is something we do now in order to move the emotional healing forward. Friend, don't wait until you've moved far beyond it to forgive. Forgive while your feelings are still strong. Forgive while the emotions still come to the surface. Forgive while it still hurts. Secondly, remember that the bigger your forgiveness, the bigger your impact. People who hold on to disappointment in other people believe that they can somehow control people, maybe even change people by reminding them of that disappointment. But if you've ever tried that, you know it doesn't work. We can't do that. It never works. All it does is poison the well from which you and the people who do life with you must drink. If you hold on to your disappointment, if you hold on to your resentment, you poison yourself and those who live with you. Have you noticed how many of our modern movies feature the theme of revenge? I mean, all the Taken movies, all the Equalizer movies, on it goes. Someone is wrong, so for 2 hours, we watch Liam Neeson or Denzel Washington mete out revenge against the perpetrators. But stories of revenge change no one. They do not transform us. They do not transform others. Joseph's story has been transforming people for thousands of years because his forgiveness is legendary. And it not only cleaned his own soul, his own heart, but it changed the lives of his brothers. And if you know anything about your Old Testament history, you know God used that family in big ways. And it was in part due to Joseph. So the more disappointment you and I forgive, the more people around us will be transformed for good. The more we hang on to our resentment and the more we refuse to forgive, the less reconciliation, the less healing, the less growth. The person who changed the world the most looked down from the cross where he was being unjustly tortured to death and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And that act of forgiveness is still rippling across the world and changing lives. You see, the bigger your forgiveness, the bigger your impact.